Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. So today, we're diving into something that, let's be honest, probably gets right under the skin of almost every single one of us. We are going to look in the mirror and challenge that deep-seated cynicism we pretty much all feel about modern politics today. And to do this, we'll be drawing on a brilliant, if slightly lonely, but absolutely insightful lecture by Professor Matthew Flinders from Sheffield University. It's a piece of work that was actually highlighted and debated at length by Alastair Campbell and his readers, and it is absolutely fascinating. Look, why do 90% of us distrust politicians? I mean, really think about that for a second. It's a staggering number, right? Let's start by just validating that frustration you're probably feeling. Why does democratic politics feel so utterly broken to so many of us right now? Why does it feel like our leaders are constantly failing and the whole system is just, well, completely stalled out? It's a question that completely permeates our daily lives, our news feeds, our group chats, you name it. Okay, let's dive right into this with Section 1, Why We Hate Politics. Just look at these brutal statistics Flinders lays out for us. 90% of us totally distrust politicians. 75% believe politics in Britain is fundamentally broken and just needs urgent reform. And another 75% genuinely believe most MPs make significant amounts of money by using their public office improperly, basically lining their own pockets. This data perfectly maps the incredibly wide and widening chasm of trust between the people governing and the people being governed. It's a gap that pretty much defines our modern era. But then you get to this metric, 65%. That is the percentage of people who believe MPs actually put their own personal interests ahead of their party, their constituents, or even their country. This right here represents the absolute peak of modern political disillusionment. When we look at the very people representing us, a vast majority of us assume the absolute worst of their motives right out of the gate. Which brings us to Section 2, the expectations gap. So here's a thought. What if the root of the problem isn't actually just the politicians themselves? What if the real crisis is deeply rooted in our own warped expectations of them? This brings us to an absolutely crucial concept coined by David Miliband called the expectations gap. Basically, this is the massive disconnect between what politicians promise and what the public expects versus what the state can realistically actually deliver with limited resources. This gap, it acts as the hidden root cause of our constant, endless political disappointment. Politicians increase supply through big promises to win our votes, but they literally cannot deliver on all of them. It just sets the stage for inevitable failure. We kind of need to completely reframe how we see the system entirely. Democratic politics is not some flawless vending machine designed to give everyone exactly what they want when they press a button. Instead, think of it more like a vice. It is, by definition, the really tough, messy process of squeezing collective decisions out of multiple, often fiercely competing interests. The actual beauty of politics is the compromise itself, which means someone, somewhere, inevitably, has to settle for less, just to maintain order and avoid perpetual conflict. Let's move on to Section 3, Citizens versus Consumers. You know, over time, we've undergone this massive shift in how we view our relationship with the government. We've essentially replaced state logic, which relies on collective provision, sharing the umbrella, and externalized rationing, with market logic. In a market, you push a shopping cart. It's all about individual choice. You're a consumer, and you expect to get exactly what you pay for. But the state simply cannot function like a private marketplace. It just doesn't work that way. This toxic shift has created what we call the consumer citizen. We now assert our individual rights without any regard to the rights of others. We expect instant, private sector-level service from the government, like a drive-through. But in doing so, we've completely forgotten about collective endeavor and our own social duties. Things like the simple civic responsibility of maintaining a healthy lifestyle so we don't overburden the health system, or making sure kids are actually ready to learn when they arrive at school. Because we act like super demanding customers, we view any form of resource rationing by the state as deeply unfair, rather than what it actually is, a mathematical necessity. Let's shift gears to Section 4, the media crisis machine. Now, obviously, we didn't get here entirely on our own. We have to look at the major external force artificially driving our expectations way up while simultaneously driving our trust way down: the modern media. Take this striking quote from veteran journalist Jeremy Paxman. He perfectly captures this phenomenon of expectation inflation. He points out that in an era of 24/7 news channels, the story needs to be kept moving, constantly hyped. Even the slightest development is fallen upon as if it were a press release announcing the second coming. The media literally has to invent or exaggerate crises just to hold our attention.
And when you look at the numbers, it's mind-blowing. Check out the staggering structural shift cited by the late Robin Cook. Back in the 1970s, the ratio of positive to negative political stories in the press was about 3 to 1. Not bad, right? Fast forward to the 2000s, and it had flipped entirely to one positive story for every 18 negative ones. 1 to 18. This relentless, manufactured negativity aggressively corrodes public confidence and totally warps our perception of what is actually happening in the halls of power.
And treating every single issue like an apocalyptic crisis has severe real-world consequences. It completely drains politicians' focus from long-term governance because they are constantly desperately putting out daily media fires. It creates this constant illusion of systemic failure. Politicians get blamed for simple human mistakes or even acts of God. They essentially become these convenient lightning rods for wider societal anger, taking the absolute brunt of public outrage over huge, complex things like global banking crises, while the unidentifiable figures who actually cause the problem sneak away totally unnoticed. Finally, we arrive at Section 5, in praise of messy politics. Okay, it's time to pivot for a second and look at a spirited, genuinely impartial defense of the vital, messy role that politicians actually play in a functioning society. Politicians operate on this impossible tightrope called the governing paradox. On one hand, they obviously have to garner popular support to get elected. But on the other hand, as Winston Churchill noted, the first business of government is to actually govern. And that requires the moral nerve to make highly unpopular decisions. True leadership frequently requires looking the public right in the eye and denying them what they currently want, all for the greater good. Let's actually see how this builds a case for politics by showcasing some real historical proof points. Because while activists certainly start the pressure, it takes brave, often intensely lonely political leadership to actually push these changes through Parliament, frequently facing vicious media and public backlash along the way. Think about the abolition of capital punishment in 1965, or the decriminalization of homosexuality in 1967. Or today's incredibly difficult, unpopular push for necessary environmental lifestyle changes. These are massive, civilized leaps forward, and every single one of them was achieved through the messy, grinding machinery of politics. And, we really should remind ourselves of what the actual alternatives to this messy democratic system are. As highlighted by journalists who observe failed states, the alternative is a vast, dysfunctional morass. It's arbitrary rule. It's having to literally pay a bribe just to see a nurse or get help from a police officer. It is a society completely governed by violence and fear, lacking any collective safety nets whatsoever. Our democratic politics might be deeply flawed and immensely frustrating, for sure, but it is the very thing standing between us and total anarchy. Which brings us right to this incredibly powerful quote from Teddy Roosevelt, delivered over a century ago. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who spends himself in a worthy cause. It is way too easy to just carp from the sidelines. We really should celebrate those who actually step up to tackle the thankless, gritty realities of collective governance. So I want to leave you with this provocative final thought. When you look at the state of the world today, are you simply a consumer demanding instant service? A critic pointing out every stumble from the safety of the sidelines? Or are you willing to temper your expectations, recognize the absolute value of compromise, and step up as a responsible citizen in the arena? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I genuinely hope it leaves you seeing the messy business of politics in a completely new light.